Next question says, which statement accurately describes debts and deficits? Check all that apply. Number one, A says debt is free and does not affect a government. B says a government's budget deficit causes its debts to increase. C says a government's budget deficit causes debts to decrease. D says debt requires the government to pay back more than it has borrowed. And E says the deficit is the amount government spends above what it brings in. And so let's quickly go over the definitions of debt and deficit. It's an important distinction and they cannot be used interchangeably. Debt refers to, or let's start with deficit. Deficit refers to an annual difference between expenditure and revenue by the government. If the government spends more money than it receives in tax revenue, then it runs a deficit, which means it has to borrow money to make up the rest of its spending, right? Yes. Just like you and me, if we spent more money than we made at our job, then we would have to borrow money to cover the rest of our spending. So the government's borrowing to cover that annual deficit is called a deficit. And so that's something that happens on a year-to-year basis. You can't have a deficit one year and not a deficit on another year, although the government traditionally runs a deficit every year, historically. The next question is, okay, so we know what a deficit is, an annual difference. What about debt? So debt is if you took all of the historical deficits we've ever run up, and you added them all up together, and you subtracted the amount that we've paid off of those deficits, or the amount that we've paid off our loans for that borrowing, and you get the debt. So it's the overall sum total of what the government might owe this year, right? And so right now, I actually haven't looked this up recently, but I think the debt is around $17 or $18 trillion. It's actually probably larger. So that's how much the United States government owes overall right now through all the borrowing we've ever done to different countries or different institutions or different debtors, right? Basically people who hold our debt. And the other number, deficits, is simply in this year or last year, how much more did we spend than we made in? And I think it was around $1 trillion, right? And so that's the big difference between the two. And that $1 trillion will be added to the deficit overall. Okay, so now we understand the difference. Let's take a look at the previous year's let's take a look at the answer choices. A says that debt is free and does not affect the government, and that's false. Like, debt is not free, right? You have to borrow money from somebody, whether it be from American bondholders or from other countries or from the Social Security deposits, Social Security Reserve Fund. Debt has to come from somewhere, and so it's not free, and it does affect the government because debt not only needs to be paid back, but it also earns interest. And so as our debt grows larger and larger, the interest that we owe on that debt goes larger and larger as well, and that affects each year's budget proposal for how much money we have to actually spend on other things. So the debt is not free and it does affect the government. So A is not right. B says a government's budget deficit causes debt to increase. That's true. We know that if the government runs a deficit, that gets added to the already existing debt to result in our new debt, right? So B is definitely correct. C says a deficit causes debt to decrease. That's not true. We just said it causes debt to increase. D says that debt requires the government to pay back more than it has borrowed, and we just talked about this, that's true, because when you borrow money, not only do you pay off the principal, but you also have to pay the interest, and so debt is going to actually cost us more over the long run than just what we borrowed, and so D is not correct either. D is true. E says that the deficit is the amount a government spends above what it brings in, and so that is also right. That's the definition of deficit. And so let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. In economics, debt is a financial instrument which is used to increase capital and paying a fixed rate of interest on that to the bondholder, like taking a loan from someone else. The budget deficit is a situation where government revenue is less than government expenditure. It means it is a situation where the government spends more than what they get. The government is in deficit, then they create debt for that which increases the debt. In that case, the government needs to pay more than the amount they have borrowed. Therefore, B, D, and E are correct, and that matches up with what we said. Great. I just want to further clarify. To clarify, a deficit is an annual discrepancy where the government's expenditures exceed its revenue. The debt is the cumulative total of all deficits run by a government minus the amount that has been paid off, giving us the total amount that a government owes to debt holders. Okay, solution is correct.